just a few things that I did beforehand, and I'll give you a couple minutes if you need it to prep this. I've already soaked my corn husks in water. You can soak them in hot water to kind of expedite the process. So if you put some boiling water over them in a big pot or a big bowl, and then use something heavy to submerge them, like a coffee mug filled with water, a bowl filled with water, and that way they kind of all stay pretty submerged in that. So that's one thing you want to prep ahead of time, just so that it has enough time. And essentially what you're trying to do is just get the leaves to become rehydrated so they become really pliable, and you can shape them into your tamal shape. Now, the other thing that I have prepped ahead of time, now I'm gonna be a little bit more, I guess, ahead of the game, because I am gonna be speaking as I go, but I have measured all of my things out. So I have all my things mised out, as we say, mise en place, everything in its place. So if it called for, 4 tablespoons of this, a cup of that, I've already measured that out and I have everything pretty portioned out. And I also, 2 other kind of main prep things that I did is I did char my chiles already. So your poblanos and your jalapeños for the pipián, I did char those just over an open flame. I did that on my stovetop, just directly on the burner. Just kind of keeping an eye on it, using some heat-proof tongs to turn them as you see that you get that nice blackening that happened. And I did that ahead of time because I didn't want you to all just watch me charring since we have so much to cook today. So this is what my poblano and my jalapeños are looking like, sort of this charred bit here. And the last thing that I prepped that you can kind of just have going on your stove, keeping an eye on it, is I toasted, just dry toasted. You could do this in your oven if you don't want to be looking at it and kind of mixing as you go. I dry toasted my pepitas and my pistachios. So you can put them on a baking sheet at 350 and let them just toast in there. It could take anywhere between maybe about 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, just kind of shaking them every now and then to see how they're doing. So everybody's like getting into action right now. I love it, So those are kind of the main things I prepped. I also prepped other things because I already have 2 tamales, just 2. So hopefully I'm like praying that they don't kind of fall into the pot too much. I was trying to look to see if there was something else I can put into the pot to kind of hold them up. Because usually when you cook tamales, it's a big pot. I have a strainer at the bottom of the pot and water beneath it. And you usually line all these tamales in there, and they're all standing up because they're all kind of holding each other up. But there's just 2 in this big pot that I want to show you towards the end of class. So I'm trying to think of what I can place in there so that they don't slip down and kind of open up any or at all. So they kind of still look great. So I have those cooking ready to go. It'll be our ta-da finished piece at the end of class. Other logistical things aside from the preparation, if you're new to this space, new to the Todo Verde cooking class space, this is meant to be interactive. So if you at any point have any questions, you want to add to the conversation, you want to add, a tip on some of the ingredients that we're working with here, please feel free to. You can do it verbally. You can unmute yourself and join in on the conversation. I just ask that you mute yourself after that's resolved so that we don't have any background sound. We're recording today, and we are going to be sharing this with the other folks who are registered for the class. And if you don't feel comfortable sharing your audio or you verbally sharing your question, you can definitely enter that into the chat. My colleague Sarah is here. She'll be reading those questions off to me as I get through the process of cooking, since I won't be going into the chat very much myself. So she's here to support as well. And if you have any issues with sound, with the video, please just let us know in the chat, and then or verbally, and Sarah will help kind of handle that. You'll also see, oh, I haven't actually gotten my other one turned on here. So you should see the main video where you see my face, and then I'm going to turn on Zoom on my phone as well. So you'll have a separate camera view, and this is going to be of my stovetop. So that way you can kind of go back and forth with me as I go from cooking the ingredients to prepping up at the main camera on my laptop. So let me make sure this is, there you are. So you should be able to see those two there. I'm gonna set my camera kind of far back because I keep overheating it because it's so close to my stove. But you should be able to see my cast iron skillet. It has some residue because I toasted my pepitas earlier, but this is where I'm gonna cook my jackfruit, and then my tamales are gonna cook in this big old pot right here. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's make tamales, everyone. So my name is Jocelyn Ramirez. I am the chef and founder of Verde. It's a plant-based food business here in Los Angeles. And I also published a cookbook, which we're going to be cooking a whole lot out of today, which is called La Vida Verde. And we're going to be referencing 3 different recipes in the book. First one being the tamal, if you do have the book available in front of you, the tamal negro con yaca. It's on page 73. This is what we'll be using as our masa reference to make the masa for the tamales. And then I'm also referencing page 79, which is for my jackfruit, my pipián sauce. So that I'm referencing that, although here it's in a taco form. And then lastly, I'm going to be referencing my crema from page 117. So I have this in front of me. I do want to get started on the jackfruit because that is going to take some time to cook. So that's going to be a little bit of a priority for us here. And again, as you're prepping at home, if you still haven't toasted those pepitas, you can do that on the stovetop in a dry skillet or in the dry baking sheet in the oven. And you also want to just char over an open flame your poblanos, your jalapeños. If you have a electric burner, you don't have a gas burner on hand, then you can absolutely just put your poblanos and your jalapeños in a skillet. You can use a little bit of oil if you want to lightly pan fry them and just let them cook over your skillet if you don't have that open flame. I personally love charring over an open flame. I think it adds a nice element of flavor that you can't get in anything else, right? So let's go ahead and get into it. Before we get started, any questions with any of the prep stuff? Hopefully everybody's good to go. Okay, and then for the jackfruit, what I did is I have 3 cans of young green jackfruit that I took out of the can. I poured the jackfruit into a strainer over my sink, and I drained all that brine out, and I gave it a good rinse. And now I'm going to show you kind of what that jackfruit looks like. So let me take one more look at my tamales here. They're slipping, but they look okay. All right. So I'm going to just pan down so you can see the jackfruit a little bit more closely. You should see my cutting board here. I've already prepped a majority of the jackfruit, but I'm going to show you how I prepare it, how I break it down here. So one thing to take note of is with the jackfruit, you're going to see, and before I get started with it, this is young green jackfruit, not to be confused with a ripe, whole, fresh jackfruit. You can find jackfruit here in the States, but when you do, it's typically already a little bit ripe. It's developed some sugars and it doesn't really work for these savory recipes very well. So you want to make sure that you get either canned or in a pouch, pretty much just like young green, underripe jackfruit that's been kind of shocked to stay green and underripe. And this is going to be a nice blank canvas for us. Now you'll see there's a line here, and below this line there's like this core piece that's a little bit more firm to the touch. I wouldn't say it's super tough, but it kind of breaks apart versus like kind of shredding apart the way that this top portion does. Notice how I can apply a little bit of pressure on this top portion and it shreds, and it looks very similar to a texture of a shredded meat. Now, this is the texture that I'm absolutely looking for in a jackfruit. This texture below doesn't really have that, but we still want to use it because we don't want to create any food waste. So I'll show you how I break it down. But before I get into breaking it down, the last step that I want to do to prep my jackfruit is I want to just squeeze out any of the liquid. I gave it a rinse. It was in a brine. I want to just use my hands to just squeeze out all that liquid, because what that's going to do is that's just going to make our seasoning kind of bland, right? Because there's going to be all this other additional liquid in there that's going to kind of not allow the jackfruit to fully absorb and become super flavorful. So I just want to get rid of this excess. Now I've seen, if you've seen other jackfruit videos out there, other people prepping jackfruit, I've seen folks just not do this step at all. They literally go from like can of jackfruit, dump out the liquid, and then they just dump the whole chunks of jackfruit in the pan. That's not my personal preference. I think it is good to kind of break it down a bit further because you're going to get an even more flavorful jackfruit. So you can see here, I have probably about, I don't know, maybe like a third of a cup or half a cup of liquid that came out from just these few pieces of jackfruit. So I want to get rid of that. This is going to go in my sink. I'm not using it. And then I have here my squeezed pieces of jackfruit. And what I want to do is I'm going to use my knife here. And again, I'm looking for that line. Sometimes it's a little bit lower, sometimes it's a little bit higher, but I'm looking for that line where I can see that the core then becomes the shreddable bits of jackfruit. So I just want to separate those two. So now I have this chunk, this core that does not shred. I'm going to make it its own little pile. And then this top shreddable bit, sometimes you'll also see these seeds in there, these little seed pods that look round. Those are going to go in the same pile as the cores. And I'm just going to check the top. Sometimes they'll kind of pop out, the little seeds will. And essentially I'm creating two piles, a pile of this like nice texture that I like, that's ready to go, and a pile of jackfruit that still needs a little bit of work. And so I'm just going through my jackfruit here, putting the cores and the seeds in that pile that still needs to be minced up, and then bringing my shreddable bits of jackfruit to the other pile. So just kind of going through, it takes a little bit of time to do this, but I think that it's an important step for a few reasons. You know, you want to make sure that the jackfruit really does look as close to a meat as possible, and these shapes, the seed pods and the cores, don't really give it that meat-like look, so it kind of sometimes looks a bit odd. So I like to break it down to kind of try to get it to blend in a little bit more. And then also, you're not able to really penetrate flavor-wise your seasoning or whatever you're adding, your sauces, through this big old chunk of core. So jackfruit is a really, really kind of bland, neutral flavor. It's ready to absorb, all the marinades and the seasoning and everything that you're going to make it taste like, but it won't penetrate through that core piece. It'll just kind of coat the outside, make the outside taste really good. But then when you take a bite of it, it's going to be bland in the center. So I don't want that. I want every bite of jackfruit here to be very delicious. So I'm just kind of going through, finishing up my piles here. Just checking for those seeds. And then this jackfruit that's all shreddy, for lack of a better word, this jackfruit is going to go in my bowl of jackfruit that's ready to go. And then I'm going to either use, if you have a food processor on hand, you can absolutely use a food processor to mince up this jackfruit. It'll make your life a whole lot faster. We use a industrial food processor for the jackfruit that we go through with Verde. But if you don't have that, or if you just want to kind of not maybe get another piece of equipment dirty in your kitchen, you can totally just use your chef's knife, or the largest knife you have, just so that you can kind of rock side to side and just mince up these seed pods and these cores. And you just want to get them minced to a point where they're not so teeny tiny, where they just kind of start to blend into the shapes that we have with the more completed jackfruit, the more like prepped jackfruit that's shreddable. It's never going to be exactly the same as that, but once they're small enough, it kind of gets blended in the cooking process pretty well. And this is just going to make sure that we don't waste. I know a lot of folks who used to throw away these pieces because it didn't look like meat, and they would just throw it in the trash, which is, I think, for me, very odd. Like, you want to get as much jackfruit as you can. So I am a big fan of trying to use up every little last bit. So this, you can see here the texture It's not perfect, right? It's just kind of all minced, different shape sizes, but it's much smaller than it was before. So I'm gonna add this to my bowl. And then I'm going to use my hands to just break down any other large bits that I see. So the shreddable bits of jackfruit that were on the top, I was just kind of cutting them off, checking for seeds, but I just want to use my hand here to just break down any large pieces, just to make sure, again, we're penetrating every area of the jackfruit with that seasoning, and that we also get a nice crispiness throughout many bits of the jackfruit, a nice kind of searing, and it's going to just make it so much more flavorful, trust. So it's going to make the process more delicious for you. So these are the steps that I see most folks avoid, or not avoid, I would say maybe they don't know to do this, but they just skip these steps and go right into the pan. And sometimes people will also not cook their jackfruit first. Like they'll go from this raw jackfruit and maybe they'll just drop it in a soup or a sauce and let this cook in that sauce. I prefer to still go through the step of cooking this in a little bit of oil and browning it before adding a sauce, because you're just adding on a layer of flavor that you otherwise wouldn't get. So same reason if you have cooked meat in the past, or cook meat currently, you know, sometimes when people are making a stew or something, they'll brown their beef or they'll brown their chicken first and get a nice sear on it, and then they'll add the sauce or the broth or whatever it is that they're using, because that searing is adding a layer of complexity and flavor that you otherwise wouldn't get. So same idea goes here. So I'm just gonna give my hands a rinse, and then I'm gonna start seasoning and cooking this as we get our other elements ready. Any questions so far? All right. Okay, so my jackfruit is all shredded up. Let me grab the other elements that are gonna go in here. We're gonna season it pretty simply. You can absolutely add more of the existing seasoning that we're using, or something else that you really love in your pantry. So first things first, I'm gonna add some oil. I have a third of a cup of cooking oil. I'm using grapeseed. It's just my personal preference for cooking here at home. You can absolutely use avocado oil, vegetable oil, whatever you may have handy at home. And so I'm just gonna go ahead and pour that. You want to add this amount of oil. It may seem like quite a bit, but it's important because when you're trying to have the jackfruit, which is a fruit, emulate meat consistency, remember that meat typically has fat in it. It has natural fat in it. And so you're trying to recreate some of that fat feeling with oil. I also have here, actually, let me get my juice in there actually. So I'm trying to go down my list here. I have a quarter cup of freshly squeezed orange juice with 2 tablespoons of freshly squeezed lemon juice. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pour that. I put it in the same container together. So again, quarter cup of orange juice with 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. So this is gonna give it a nice tanginess, a little bit of vibrancy. The orange juice, because it has sugars in it, is also gonna help us brown the jackfruit really nicely. So that's definitely a key ingredient here. Now I have for my seasoning, I have 1.5 tablespoons of ground cumin here. And that's gonna give a nice depth of flavor, this nice kind of like meaty aftertone to the dish. I have 3/4 of a teaspoon of crushed red pepper flakes, just to give a little bit of that heat from the jackfruit itself. And then I also do have here a pinch of pepper. This is freshly cracked pepper, and I'm going to add a couple pinches of salt. Now, salt, I will say, is to taste. So it really depends on what your personal preference is for saltiness. I am using a flaky kosher salt, so I'm gonna add a few pinches of that. And you can taste it in the raw form, because obviously jackfruit is a fruit, so you don't have to worry about eating, you know, tasting a raw meat. So you can definitely give that a taste. And the saltiness also depends on what type of salt you're using, or the amount of salt, because obviously pink Himalayan is not as salty as like the kosher salt that I'm using, or as a fine table salt, which is even saltier. Now I'm going to use my spatula here and give this a nice mix until everything is well incorporated. And I mentioned earlier, if you want to add, you know, now or for future, you know, times making this recipe, you can absolutely add other seasoning elements. I really love to use mushroom powder in the food that I cook here at home. You can absolutely make it a little bit spicier by adding a little bit more of that crushed red pepper flake, or you can add a little chile de árbol. You can definitely keep adding to this to make the flavor even more complex, maybe nutritional yeast, which you likely have on hand because that's on our ingredient list. You can add, you know, maybe perhaps a tablespoon of nutritional yeast, a little splash of liquid aminos or soy sauce. All these elements will definitely help to make your dish even more delicious. I'm turning on my skillet and I'm just putting it on here to about medium low heat to let that get nice and hot. And I'm going to drop my jackfruit in there. Typically I already have it on, but I was toasting the pepitas and I turned it off and I forgot to turn my pan back on. But I usually have it preheated so that it's ready to go and it can start cooking my jackfruit right away. So I'm just gonna go ahead and drop my jackfruit in there and let it come up to temperature, and we can transition over to the stove for just a moment. So you can just bring your jackfruit into your skillet again, and it should be about a medium to medium kind of low heat, depending on how hot your stovetop gets. And what you're going to look out for here in your jackfruit is just a nice browning to happen. So the sugars in the orange juice are going to help that happen. The oil is going to help that happen. If at any point you're cooking your jackfruit and it seems like it's cooking maybe a little bit too fast, that it might be burning, you can definitely lower your heat a little bit. It doesn't need to cook super fast. It's more about getting it to this nice kind of caramelized color. And jackfruit, you don't have to stand here and babysit it, but you do want to come back every now and then to check on it. So I'm going to move on to other elements of our tamales, but I'll come back and forth to check on the jackfruit and give it a little mix. Again, you can taste for salt. Let me give it a little taste. Oh, and that's really good with the lemoniness of the citrus, the vibrancy of the citrus, and it definitely has a good amount of salt. I'll taste it again as we get closer to the end product. All right, so I'm gonna let that hang out for a little bit. Again, it's on about medium heat. And then we are going to move on to start working on our pipián and our crema, starting with our crema, just to let that hang out a little bit. And then we'll work on our masa harina after that. So let me just grab a squeeze bottle that I forgot to grab earlier. Here we go. If I could ever find the tops for them. Okay, I will find that at some point, hopefully before class ends. They are somewhere around here. I'm still getting used to this new kitchen, so I have a squeeze bottle that I'll be pouring that into. So what you'll need for this recipe is you're gonna need your blender, definitely. And then the other thing that I prepped ahead of time, which was on the list, I forgot to mention it earlier, sorry if you haven't done this yet, but I do have some raw cashew pieces that I just soaked in just regular tap water. And these have been soaking for a couple of hours now. If you are using a high power blender like I am, like a Vitamix, you can soak them in some warm or hot water for about 30 minutes, and that should work pretty well. If you don't have a high power blender, you can, you know, for future reference, soak these 2 hours up to overnight. And so you want to make sure that they're soaked, just because they're going to become nice and soft and pliable. They're going to be a lot easier to blend. And I'm going to drain this liquid out. I'm not using this in the recipe. So let me go ahead and take this over to my sink. I'm just going to use my hand to just drain this liquid out. I'm going to grab my blender cup and we can get started on that process. So I'm going to walk you through 2 different ways to make the crema. And it's up to you which way. You can make both ways today and kind of see if you prefer either or. So the first way I'm going to talk about is a really simplified version, which just includes adding literally the soaked cashews, water, lemon juice, and salt. 4 ingredients. You blend it up, and once it's nice and smooth, you're done. It's like this tangy, salty crema. Now, if you want to add complexity to the flavor, then you can include these other ingredients that we had listed, as such as the nutritional yeast and the acidophilus. Now, the acidophilus is a culture. So what that does is it creates fermentation. It provides space for the cream to ferment. So if you are going to ferment your crema, perhaps this would mean that you're going to eat it tomorrow, not today. You could eat it today, but it's not going to be fermented. And so with the crema, with the fermentation, what you would do is blend just the cashews with the water, no salt, no lemon juice, no nutritional yeast, just smooth cashew paste, add your probiotic capsules, and let that hang out in a glass container with a cheesecloth or plastic with the holes poked in it on your countertop in just like a dark place for 12, 15 hours. Sometimes it depends on, like right now we're in winter time, right? For not really so much here in LA, but kind of. And so fermentation is a little bit slower because the weather is cooler. So it could take a little bit longer until you really start to smell and taste some of that kind of funkiness that the fermentation brings to the cashew cream. And then once you get that fermentation in place, once you've allowed that amount of time to pass and fermentation to do its thing, then you add the lemon juice, the salt, the nutritional yeast, and you flavor that cultured cashew cream to kind of another level. So I am going to walk you through what that kind of fermented option looks like, but know that if you want to eat it now, you could, but you're throwing the probiotics in there. It's going to be good for our tummies, but it's not going to really allow the fermentation. You need time beyond today's class to get that going. Let me check on my jackfruit.
Can I just ask a quick question on this?
Sure.
On the fermentation, is there a big difference in the way that it tastes? And I don't know if you can describe that at all, but like what's the advantage to doing fermented versus just the regular without fermenting, or difference?
Yeah. Well, I mean, most cheeses and creams that are made with animal products are fermented. So there's kind of this, I don't know how exactly to describe it. It's just sort of this like funky, cheesy kind of flavor that fermentation provides that you can't get from just the lemon juice. The lemon juice will kind of mask it and make it feel tangy. And to be honest with you, it tastes fine when you eat it with other things. But if you want it to taste like a true crema, like the kind of crema, Mexicana that you would buy to put on top of tamales, that crema is fermented. So, like I'm saying, all cheeses are fermented typically, right? Not all, but most are fermented. And so you're kind of missing that like sense of like aging and that funk that the fermentation provides.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so I have here my raw cashew pieces. Let me look at this just to make sure. I don't have all of my recipes memorized, but thank goodness I have this book where I can just look at my own recipes. So I have 3/4 cup of these raw cashew pieces. They're now soft and pliable. And the other thing I want to mention is I get them raw versus toasted because toasted is another flavor to the cashews, and I don't want that toasted flavor. In fact, I'm trying to mask the fact that there's any cashews in here, and the raw cashews taste less flavorful. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop in my 3/4 cups of my soaked and drained cashew pieces. And then I'm going to add in here a 1/2 cup of just regular water, just regular water that you have on hand. And I'm gonna blend this until it's smooth and creamy. So I'm gonna take this over to my Vitamix right behind me. I'll blend until it's nice and smooth and creamy. Let me show you the consistency in just a moment. So you want to blend, as you can see, for a little bit of time. It's not a little bit, it's kind of a lot of it, but maybe it was about a minute or so. And you want to blend on high speed. So you start off low, crank it up. And I like to use my Vitamix tamper here to kind of scrape the sides to make sure I don't have any bits of cashews as it's blending that are kind of sticking to the sides and then are going to be kind of these weird chunks in my crema. I want it to be really smoothed out. If you don't have a tamper, you can stop your blender, remove the lid, and use a spatula to scrape down the sides, put the lid back on, and keep blending. And this is the consistency that you're looking for. So as you can see, it's nice and smooth and creamy. I can run my finger across the back of this tamper and it holds the line. It's nice and thick. Now it's really just seriously just cashew paste. It tastes very much like cashews right now. And at this point, notice that I haven't added my probiotics yet. What you would do is you would add this to a bowl or something like that, right? And then you would add the probiotics to it. And like I mentioned, the probiotics are these little capsules. I'm using acidophilus, you can use J-dophilus, you can use other cultures that you might have on hand. And you want to just use the powder that's in the capsules, not the exterior capsule itself. So you would just open up the capsule and just pour in the probiotic into your bowl, your blender. You don't want to blend this at high speed with the probiotics in there. You can pulse it if you want to. But the reason you don't want to is because these are live cultures and extreme heat or just too much agitation can kill them. And then you won't have fermentation that happens. So I'm just going to give these a little pulse just to whip them in. And then I'll be good to go. And I would let that sit, not in the blender, but in a bowl and something else, and let that sit and ferment. And then tomorrow I would come back to it. I'll keep going as if we're at tomorrow. I didn't prep a version of this before that has already gone through the fermentation process, but I'll keep prepping as if now we're on at Monday. No, Sunday. My days are mixed up. Okay, so just enough to kind of get those ingredients worked in. And let's imagine that, wow, this tastes so fermented. It's been hanging out on my shelf or on my countertop for the last day or so. And now it has a good element of funk to it. You can bring it back into your blender again. And then at this point, you would go ahead and add your nutritional yeast. I have here 1 teaspoon of nutritional yeast. If it's an ingredient you haven't worked with in the past, it's kind of this like cheesy, funky ingredient that a lot of plant-based cheeses have in them. And it's literally a yeast. It's going to go right in here and give it a nice cheesy flavor for us. So that's also going to kind of help give it that funky fermentation cheesiness. And then I'm also going to add some lemon juice. Now the lemon juice is going to give it a nice bit of tanginess. You can add anywhere between 1 to 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. So I have my tablespoon measure here. I have a lemon squeezer. I'm going to go ahead and add, I have 1 to start off, and I'll give it a taste and see if it needs more. So there's 1 tablespoon that's in there now. And lastly, I'm going to add my salt. Now, the reason you don't want to add like things like salt and lemon juice prior to the fermentation is because the probiotics, the cultures, they don't like that acid environment, and so that also kills them. You know, too much lemon, too much salt will not allow the probiotics to do their thing. So that's why you add it at the end of the process. Now let me give this another pulse. So essentially my demo, I'm kind of wasting the probiotics right now because like I said, I'm not going to get fermentation from this batch, but it's all good. And you end up with this kind of fermented, funky, creamy cashew cream. That is so good. I'm going to add a little bit more salt, and I will add the other tablespoon of my lemon juice just to give it a little bit more acidity. So I have my other half of a lemon here. I'm using a Meyer lemon. You can use whatever lemon you have on hand. And I'm gonna add another pinch of salt. And that will be good to go. Let me give it another little run through the blender to incorporate everything. All right, so we have our cashew cream that is good to go. Any questions on that? Ooh, I see that. Is that the cream you just made? Yeah, right? That's your blender. Great, that looks great, Dylan. Ooh, I see, yeah, all the bullets. Great, all right. So I'm just gonna set that aside for now. And then at some point, hopefully I'll find the cap to my squeeze bottle because I like to put this in I have a little mini squeeze bottle so that I can nicely squeeze over the cream on the tamales. Let me get rid of some of these dishes here and we're gonna get into our pipián. So I have another blender cup. You can use the same blender if you want. Maybe take out all of that cream, scrape it. You don't even have to rinse it if you don't want to because the green of the poblanos and the chiles and all the seeds and nuts are gonna definitely overpower that. So if you wanna just scrape it and reuse that same blender, you totally can. Let me turn or mix my jackfruit a little bit. Ooh, and I'm getting too overconsumed over here. Let me lower my heat because I am starting to get a little bit of blackening that's happening. That's totally okay. Just want to make sure I'm cooking this a little bit more evenly. And I'm actually gonna, I know I added the 1/3 of a cup of my oil. I'm gonna give it a touch more oil. I just have my big old container of grapeseed oil. I'll add about another, maybe like 1/8 of a cup, couple tablespoons of oil. And that's gonna help it keep browning, sizzling. That's the only thing that you'll need to look out for jackfruit. It might dry out in the cooking process. Right now, I think my heat was just a little bit too high. It was directly on right at medium. So I just lowered it to kind of in between medium and low. And especially since I'm not really babysitting it too much right now. And that oil will evaporate quickly and it'll kind of dry out your jackfruit. So you just want to add more moisture to it. If you don't want to add more oil, you can absolutely add perhaps a little bit more of your orange juice, a little bit of vegetable broth, although the vegetable broth doesn't give it that browning and that searing that the oil does. So I'll let that keep working. Now,
sorry, question. For that, would it work to use that reserve liquid that you squeezed out?
I wouldn't use that because that's a brine. So that's pretty much like what's preserving it so that it doesn't, you know, turn into a ripe jackfruit. I would instead use vegetable broth or even just fresh water if you didn't want to use additional oil. Great. Okay. All right. So my blender cup already has some pipián in it because I made a small batch before class so I can get those tamales working during our class. So my blender will look a bit dirty, but it's the same things that are going in there. Now, I also did toast ahead of time, like I mentioned, my pistachios. I just dry toasted them on the same skillet that's actually cooking the jackfruit right now. Before the jackfruit was in there, it didn't have any oil or anything in it. It's a seasoned pan, but still a dry pan. And I just dry toasted. I did a whole cup because I like to have my seeds and my nuts. I like to cook them in batches so I can store them in the fridge. And when I do need it for a sauce like this, I can just easily pull out the pre-cooked or the pre-toasted seeds and nuts. So I did a whole cup. Obviously, I'm not going to use all of these right now. I'm only going to use 2 tablespoons of each. So the thing to note with the pistachios is, you know, you're not going to see like a whole lot of color shift. The pistachios already do have this sort of like brown shade to them, but you will smell the toastiness of them. And you might see a slight little bit of like dark brown, it's almost blackening that'll happen. So they don't really change too much in their shape. However, the pepitas, if you haven't dry toasted these before, you could absolutely see the difference here. They go from this really light green shade or vibrant green shade to a more toned down brownish green shade. And they also change in their shape where you can see that they were flatter when they were raw and now they've kind of like plumpened up. They've kind kind of, it's almost like they want to pop. So you'll see that the shape of the seed also changes. And once you take them off the heat, they'll still continue to crackle and make noise. So these are really the stars of our pipián sauce, along with the poblanos. The pepitas are our typical ingredient in all pipianes. So pipián you mostly see throughout areas such as Zacatecas in Mexico, where it's a red, like a brick red sauce, and you see the pepitas along with guajillos, sometimes anchos or pasilla chiles. It's rare to see pistachios in it, but this is just my take on Pipián Verde. So I'm going to, in my blender here, add, let me grab my measuring spoons that have that little bit of lemon juice and dry them out. So I have here, let me open up to that page. I'm going to use 2 tablespoons of my pepitas, 2 tablespoons of my pistachio. So just literally measure out 2 tablespoons of each of these. This is what's going to help balance the heat, what's going to give it a nice amount of thickness. There we go. So that's my 2 tablespoons of each. You can absolutely, if you made extra like me, those are also great as a garnish on your tamales once they're cooked. Like a little bit of pepitas on top with it would look amazing. Okay, and then the other elements that I have are a cup of vegetable broth. You can just use your store-bought vegetable broth that's in a carton. I actually use, let me show you what I use out of my fridge really quick. This is a bouillon that you can buy that is jarred, and it's essentially kind of like a paste. It's a vegetable-based bouillon paste. And what you do to make a cup of vegetable broth is you take a teaspoon out of this paste and you mix it with hot or warm water until it dissolves. And that's what I use in a pinch. And I've kind of been getting a little bit more into this too, because it's less waste than the big old carton. So I'm going to add, before I add my vegetable broth, I'm gonna add my chiles to it. So this recipe will call for 2 roasted or charred poblano peppers. Poblanos are also sometimes called pasilla peppers, and they're nice and wide. They're very mild in their spiciness. So every once in a while you will, however, get one that's extremely spicy. It's happened to us before, but usually they're very, very mild. Typically the bigger and whiter the chile, the less spicy, because the seeds are where the spice is held, the capsaicin is, and the skin is so far from the seeds. So that's why bell peppers are also not spicy too. And then I'm using 2 jalapeños. You can use 1 to 2, whatever you have on hand. Now this is different for the poblanos than a chile relleno. In chile relleno recipes, you would remove all of this charred skin. Now for my pipián, I like to keep it on because I like that flavor. So all you have to do is you can use your hands, or you can use a knife, a paring knife. Let me actually grab a paring knife just to easily remove the stem. And all you want to do is you can just cut down through your chile and just remove or cut away from the stem. So I'm just kind of cutting away. You can put it down on the cutting board. I'll do the next one on the cutting board so it looks a little bit more clear. And I'm just kind of cutting away all the way around the stem, getting all of that charred flesh of the poblano. And you can see here that I cut away the seeds and the stem. So here's all my flesh of the poblano that's going to go directly into my blender. Now let me do that one more time with the other one. So you can set that down. If it makes it easier, you can slice off kind of one side of it, and then you'll expose, let me pan down a little bit more. So I literally just slice down, here's a piece of my poblano pepper. And I was just kind of off center because I don't want to cut right where the center, where the seeds are. I'm trying to avoid those seeds. And then I can just use my paring knife to just cut around that stem. And if you see any of it kind of trying to stick, right, like it's trying to hold on to the flesh, just you can rip that away, use your knife to remove that, and keep going around the stem until you remove that whole seed pod or the seed pods. So you also just want to make sure that you don't have any major seeds in here. just for texture. If they don't blend up, you don't want to have all these seeds in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and drop that into my blender. And then for the jalapenos, I'm going to remove the tops. You are welcome to give it a taste to see if it's overly spicy. And if it is, you can remove the seeds. This is actually not spicy at all. So I'm gonna just add the whole thing in there. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and add seeds and all. It's not very spicy of a jalapeno. And so I have that now all in here, my chiles, my charred chiles. I'm gonna add my 1 cup of my vegetable broth into the blender. And the last thing I wanna add here is some salt. So again, I have this flaky kosher salt, and I'm just going to add a few pinches, and I'll give it a taste once it's all blended up. Let me check my jackfruit. All right, just getting that a nice mix. I'm getting lots more browning here. All right, let that keep going. And I'm gonna give my Pipián a blend as well. So let me go over to my Vitamix and get this all blended up. So same thing as a crema, you want to blend until it's nice and smooth and creamy. And it should be this nice, smooth, thick consistency. Again, you should be able to run your finger across the back of the spoon or the tamper, and it holds the line. It should feel like there is a mild heat, and the heat is not piercing. It's not like an immediate attack of heat. It's more of like this back note, and you can absolutely taste the pistachios. You can taste the seeds in there. So this feels very warming, earthy. It's such a good pipián sauce. It pairs really well with this recipe. And so what you can do is you can do 2 things for your tamales. Some folks like their tamales really saucy. Some folks like them a little bit less saucy. Now, what I did earlier with the batch that I have in the steamer right now is we're gonna get into our masa. I laid out the masa on the corn leaf or the corn husk, added jackfruit, and then added sauce on top of that. Now you can definitely do that, or we can, once our jackfruit's cooked, we can pour this pipián sauce into that same pan and mix it all together until you get this nicely coated jackfruit and it's already kind of assembled together. So the first option will yield a little bit more of this like kind of creamy juiciness because it's the jackfruit doesn't really have time to just absorb it on its own when you mix it in the pot together. So just an option, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Now let's get into our masa harina so that we can start to get working on assembling a few tamales. Any other questions right now? Everyone's doing okay? I'm just making sure my jackfruit is looking okay here. I have it on kind of a lower heat right now, just because I'm working so many other elements that I don't want to burn it to a crisp. I just want to make sure it gets nice and cooked through. So I am going to start working on this masa harina. Let me show you here what I have. Let me open up to that page. There we go. So again, I already pre-soaked my corn husks. I soaked a little bit over 24. 24 should be good, but I made a few extra before class, and then I have this extra masa harina that I made before class to make those tamales that are working in the steamer right now. I have 3 cups of masa harina. Now the masa harina that I am using is this Bob's Red Mill masa harina. It's yellow corn or golden corn flour. It's gone through this nixtamal process. You can absolutely use you know, any other brands. Macienda is very popular. Gold Mill is very popular. There's a bunch out there. One thing that I always mention when you're looking at any masa harina, make sure that the only ingredients that you see are corn. It could be organic corn, that would be great, and hydrated lime or trace of lime. Those are the only 2 ingredients you should see. If you start to see a bunch of other ingredients and elements, then that means that it's more processed, it has more preservatives in it, likely the flavor is not as great. One brand that we see often is Maseca, and that is not my preferred brand. So if you're using that, it's totally fine, but it definitely has a whole bunch of other ingredients. You'd really want just corn, and you're gonna add your elements to make it masa preparada. The other thing, let me get turned on, is my hot water kettle, because I'm going to add some hot water to this. So what we're going to be adding to our masa harina is I have here 3 cups, and I used the cup measure and I poured my masa harina into the cup measure. A lot of times what we do is we stick the cup measure into the bag and we scoop out the masa harina or any flour for that matter. And what you do when you do that is you're trying to scoop and you're like really like compacting the amount of flour that you add in there. So you actually end up with more than a cup. So for example, you know, here is a cup, right? But if I compacted this and it became really tight, then I would add more, and then I'd get really dry tamales, really dry tortillas, really dry cookies, really dry cake. So just make sure that you're not compacting and that you're pouring in to your cooking, your measuring containers. So I have 3 cups of dry masa harina, and I'm going to add some hot water to it. I'm going to add 2 cups. My hot water, it was already warm, so it shouldn't take too long, but I'll measure out 2 cups of that hot water that's going to activate this masa harina that's been dried. And since my stuff, it's kind of chilly at my house right now, so not everything got to room temperature, even though it's been sitting out this whole time and a little bit before class. So I do have 1 cup here of refined coconut oil. Now, it's really important to use refined here and not virgin coconut oil. Virgin coconut oil is going to make your tamales taste like coconut. So you want to make sure it's refined, which means it has no flavoring of coconut anymore. So this is 1 cup, and it might seem like a lot, but masa preparada definitely has a good amount of fat and lard in it, which, fun fact, I mean, tamales have been made for generations and generations prior to colonization ever happening, prior to us having pork, chicken, beef, prior to us obviously then having lard available, or, you know, oils for that matter. So I can imagine that our tamales back then were maybe a bit more dry, maybe cracked a little bit easier. The texture was different, but we've evolved tamales as we've evolved post-colonization. So this is kind of replacing that sort of lard texture or that fattiness. So it's 1 cup of refined coconut oil, and I have 4 tablespoons of softened vegan butter. I'm using here Miyoko's brand. You can use Earth Balance or whatever brand that you prefer to use. So that's 4 tablespoons of vegan butter. And I'm also going to add, I have here 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Now these 2 teaspoons of baking powder are going to help make our masa harina and our tamales nice and fluffy. So I'll go ahead and sprinkle that on. That's 2 teaspoons of baking powder. I'm going to add a couple pinches of salt. I'll definitely taste this to make sure that my preferred level of saltiness is just right. And I'm going to bring in my hot water. I have 2 cups of hot water, and I also have 1 cup of vegetable broth that I'm going to be adding. Again, I use that same bouillon that I used for the other batch of vegetable broth. So let me bring my hot water. That's also going to help me melt down any of these elements that haven't completely melted down. So for my 2 cups, I'm just using the same measuring container that I used for the masa harina, and I'm going to measure in my 2 cups. There we go. 2 cups. And then I have my 1 cup of my vegetable broth. There we go. Set that aside. And I'm going to grab a much bigger spatula because this will take me forever with this tiny one. Let me grab a slightly bigger one here. And all you want to do, you can use a hand mixer and start on the lowest setting and gently work your way up. You can do this with just a spatula. The hand mixer will make sure that you don't have any clumps in it because obviously there's that dry masa harina. But I like to work it pretty well with the spatula here. And you can see that my coconut oil, everything's getting nice and melty because that was hot water that went in there. And it's going to reactivate my dry masa harina. And I'm just going to keep pushing down. I like using a spatula here because I can scrape the sides really well. Like look at all this dry masa harina that was on the sides that I just scraped off. You can scrape from the bottom and mix it. And I can also use the flat end of my spatula to kind of press and slide across the bottom of the bowl and break up any pieces that I see here, any clumps that I don't want to see. All right. We are slowly getting there. Again, that hand mixer will make that process even better. I actually happen to not have a hand mixer here at home. I've been thinking about it, like maybe that is a tool I should consider getting for myself sometime soon. You can also use a whisk, although you will have some of it kind of clumping to the whisk and getting stuck in the center, but it's all good. So you just keep kind of working, making sure you're kind of pushing down and breaking down any potential clumps that you might see. And you should have this nice kind of gloppy consistency, and it's going to thicken up slightly because I mean you can see here just from this, I didn't cover this batch that I made before class. It's still pretty soft to the touch, but you can see how much it's kind of you know, the difference, right? Like this is holding up here where this will just slide down. And so, you know, with a little bit of time, it will continue to thicken up and sort of dry out. And so I'm gonna let that just kind of hang out for a little bit. Just let me keep checking to make sure I don't have any other bits in here that I want to break down. And I want to taste it also for salt. Just grab a little piece, taste that. Should have a nice little kind of kiss of salt, not overpowering it, but just to give it a nice little flavor. I think mine is just right. So I'm not going to add any more salt. And we are going to bring over our rehydrated corn husks. Before I do that, let me go back to my jackfruit. I turn my jackfruit all the way down now. So it's just continuing to crisp up. It's on the lowest setting. I'm gonna go ahead and pour in my Pipián sauce into this batch and just work it all together. And the Pipián will slightly thicken up with the heat. There we go. Let me see if it needs that last little bit there. So I'm just going to gently fold that all together. Whoa, it almost went overboard. So gently coming all together here. So you're gonna have this nice green, vibrant filling inside of your tamales. And it's gonna have that nice little spicy kick to it. It's gonna be so good. All right. I'm gonna pour in that last little bit of the pipián that I have there. There we are. So that just, I'm gonna leave that on that super low setting just to make sure my pipián is nice and warm through. As I mentioned, it'll thicken up just a little bit with that heat. The pepitas with the heat get activated and absorb more of that liquid. So I'll just let that hang on at the lowest setting. I'm gonna grab some of my corn husks. I'm gonna talk a little bit about my favorite types of corn husks. Let me grab one of my not favorites so I can show you the difference. Here we go, perfect. And I'm gonna work directly on my countertop. Now what you wanna do is you wanna drain. I just pulled these out of the soaking liquid. You can give them a rinse if you want to. And I'm just trying to get as much of that water out. I'm gonna bring them over to my countertop. And so you can see the corn husks here. And what you wanna do is use a paper towel, a towel to just slightly pat them dry if they're too moist. So you don't want them to be sopping wet. You just wanna make sure that they're still a little damp and pliable. And now you can see the tamal husk can work really well. And if you haven't made tamales in the past, you want to make sure that you're making the tamal in the same direction as you would roll the corn in this husk, right? So you're using the same form of the corn husk to work your tamal. You wouldn't go in the opposite direction. You would go already kind of moving, using what nature has provided to you. And you could measure out a specific amount. If you are to do that for the masa preparada, you could use perhaps a spoon or a scoop to measure out the specific amount. So I have here at home, and we use these a lot for todo verde. This is a 2-ounce scoop. This is a 1-ounce scoop. And that way food always comes out super consistent. So you can use the 2-ounce scoop, for example, and scoop out 2 ounces of the masa. Use the scoop to release that. And then you can use your hands, the back of a spoon, your spatula to spread that out. Now, it's up to you if you want to use that 2-ounce amount. Some people like their tamales a little bit larger, and you can absolutely use more of the masa and make larger tamales. My family actually from Zacatecas, we make pretty small tamales. So, you know, if you then venture out to Oaxaca, for example, their tamales are really large. So it kind of varies from region to region of what tamales look like in that area. And then I'm going to use my 1-ounce scoop to just grab a little bit of my masa, or sorry, my jackfruit and pipián verde. Let me actually grab it and bring it here so we're all in the same shot. So I'm going to turn off the heat on my pipián verde here. I'm going to bring it over to the screen. So you'll be able to kind of see a little bit of that jackfruit and pipián verde there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take about 1 ounce of this. You can add more if you want. 2 ounces should be fine. 1.5. And I'm going to simply, one thing I didn't mention. So I like to put my masa a little further over to the right. It's not right in the center of my tamal. It's a little further. So here's the right end of mine. For you, I think it might look as if it's on my left side. And I leave more of the corn husk exposed on the left. And that's just because if you do it right at the center, when you fold over, you're gonna have masa that's not touching the inside of your tamal. It's gonna be on the outside. So I grab the end first where the masa is closest to that end, and I fold it over towards the center, and I open it back up. So now it's kind of folded over the filling, and then I use the other side to fold over the filling as well. And then I'll come in with the right side, the first side that I folded over, and see all the masa is all together in the center. If you were to add masa here, this masa would be outside of the tamal. So some people do that. I think it's kind of a waste because you want to kind of eat it all together. In fact, a lot of people just like, it falls, like if, yeah, like it just, I prefer to have it be intact in the center. Now you're going to carefully and tightly wrap this tamal And the part where the husk ends, where the opening is, that is the side where I want to kind of fold the bottom part of the tamal in towards itself. So I use my thumb and my index finger to kind of pinch up slightly, and then I fold up on the same side where, so pretty much all the openings are all together on one side. And then for the top, you can leave it exposed, especially if you're making a few varieties of tamales and you want to see what's inside of this one. But if you don't want to see that, then you can just easily use your fingers to kind of pinch and seal that tamal. And so this is the way that my family would make tamales. And like I mentioned, people make them different ways. People use banana leaves instead of corn husks. Some people will use bigger corn husks and they'll make the tamal a little bit closer to the center, not so much on the very end. And they'll leave space so that as they roll, they'll tie both ends and the filling is only in the center. So that's a very, very time consuming task to do that. But it's absolutely, awesome to do that. It looks really great. But imagine then tying each one on the bottom and the top. It just takes a lot. And when you put them in your pot, I'll show you in a second, you want to put where the opening is, right? Like, so this is what would be like the back of the tamal. You want to stand that part up against your pot. So say this is my pot here. You want to make sure that they're all standing around with the openings facing the wall of the pot or the side of the pot. And then you just keep all stacking them around and around until you fill up your pot. Now, let me actually go over to my pot so I can show you before I keep rolling a few more tamales. Let me go over here and open up my pot and show you what it's looking like in here. So you're going to see a big steamy mess at first. And what I have in here is a strainer. You can use any vegetable strainer, steamer, whatever you have on hand. Worst case scenario, I've seen people literally do like balls of foil on the bottom, and then they put another piece of foil or metal over it with holes poked in it. That works. You can definitely make it the MacGyver vibes, whatever works. Essentially what you want to do is you want to create a vessel for steam, and you want to create a separation between the tamales and the water that's creating the steam below. And one thing you want to look out for is to make sure that you always have water, that you're not scorching your tamales. So you can always take a peek and check to see, oh, do I still have enough liquid down there? Do I need to add a bit more water to keep them steaming? One other point of reference is if you have a glass lid like I do, you can see that there's like lots of steam and moisture because you can see through the glass lid. And if you start to see that it looks dry like this, then you know there's no more water. There's no more steam, there's no more moisture. I need to go ASAP and get more water in there. So as I was mentioning, you want to do the openings of the tamal against this side of the olla, so that it kind of helps to hold the tamal together without opening. And you want to just keep going around in a circle, then an inner circle, then a smaller inner circle. You can pile some on top after that until you have a nice full pot of tamales. So I'm gonna let that hang out for a second before I pull them out. They're probably piping hot, those two that are ready. I'm gonna roll a couple more tamales. I know we're just getting towards the end of our time here, but just to make sure that everybody's good on the process of rolling the tamales. And the other thing I wanted to mention was regarding the corn husks. I mentioned that there's some that I'm not a huge fan of. And you'll find in your pack of corn husks, there's gonna be some that have these kind of like ripples in them. You can see maybe a little bit of that texture. And so whatever your corn husk texture is, that's gonna essentially transfer to become whatever your tamal looks like. So I just don't really love these. Sometimes I add these on the outside. So if I had a really small, not really small, but for example, like this leaf has the perfect texture, but it's pretty small. If I can ever peel it off, here we go. So this leaf has like a nice little texture to it, but it's too small for me to wrap. It's gonna kind of come apart. So what I could do is I could place it within this bigger one, and you can layer them that way. That's the way you can use those. The other way you can use the smaller leaves is if you had two smaller leaves then you want to just kind of stagger them side by side to create a bigger surface area. And then you want to make sure that wherever the top leaf is, that masa is going to fall flat on there. And when you spread it out, it's going to kind of help glue the two together. Not really glue, but you know what I mean, to kind of help keep them together to hold. So that's another step. So for example, like in this situation here, my masa is going to be holding on to mostly like half of this bottom leaf and then a little bit of this top leaf. If I had it the other way around, then my masa would mostly be on just this top leaf on this one here, and it would barely get anything here. So when I fold it over, like it's not really going to have anything to kind of grab onto. So let me go ahead and make a couple more tamales. There's somebody knocking on my door and I'm not quite sure who it is. Hold on one second. I think I need a sign. Can you all pause for 1 second? Sarah, please take over for a moment as I just answer this. Let me mute.
Does anyone want to show off anything they have going on in their kitchen right now? Let's see. I see, Sophia, you have your husks.
I actually have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I've only made for like years Mexican, like regular tamales.
Mm-hmm.
So my flour itself, the masa is it's different. I think it's a little bit.
Does it feel more liquidy or more dry?
Yeah, more liquidy. So I don't know if it's because it's vegan or if it's because I put too much liquid in it. Like too much.
Can you pan down? Let me see. Oh, yeah. I think, that might just need to sit for a little longer, right, Jocelyn? It doesn't look too liquidy.
Yeah, that doesn't look too liquidy to me. That it's a little bit firm. Maybe it's different than, so as I mentioned, like tamales are different from like region to region, family to family. So perhaps your family's masa is like a little bit thicker and you're used to seeing it a certain way. For some people, I've seen their masa and it looks really watery. Like there's one time somebody sent me a video of this, it's like a scraper, and you put a little bit of masa on it and you literally just like, you have the hoja and you scrape. And yeah. I'm like, how though? Like it's so, the masa has to be like so liquidy to do that, If not, it would kind of like roll and come off. So yeah, I think that texture that you have there is fine. And then you can use the back of a spoon or your fingers to spread it out. So let me just make one more before finishing up here. Let me mix my masa again. And I'm going to add a 4-ounce scoop of my masa to my hoja. Or let me show you a 4-ounce one, just so you can see how much bigger it is compared to the other one. 4 ounces is probably going to be a little too much. Let me take away a little bit. Here we go. 3 ounces. Here we go. So you can just spread it out. Again, I'm focusing mostly on the right side of my hoja, just to make sure that I get a nice big tamal. I'm trying to spread to the right and then also kind of get towards the bottom. So it ends up being kind of like almost a little rectangle here. And I want to make sure that I don't have any gaps where I can see the tamal husk through. I want to be able to cover up any of those gaps. So you should have something that looks kind of like that. And then you want to grab your filling. There we go. I'm going to add another little bit here. And then I'm going to fold my right side over. Let me get all these handles out of the way. Folded the right side over, opened it back up, fold the left side over, opened it back up. So you can already kind of see it's becoming a tamal there. I'm going to fold the right side over again, then fold the left side over and roll, roll, roll. I'm going to pinch. So this is where my opening is. I made this the back now. I'm going to pinch up with my index and thumb and fold towards the opening. And then I'm going to look at the top and see, do I want to keep that open or do I just want to pinch and seal that up? Some people add a little bit of masa, like they'll grab it from the bowl and cover it up there. But I find that just pinching it does the trick. So you can see here, it's not quite double the size, but you can see that substantial size difference in the tamales from just using that additional ounce. So I'm gonna grab my tamales that I have pre-cooked, or have been cooking throughout our class here today. And we can see what the final product looks like. So let me go ahead and grab one of those. And then I'm just gonna end up drizzling some cashew cream over it versus doing the whole squeeze bottle, since one day I'll find my squeeze bottle top. All right, so I'm gonna carefully, these are gonna be really soft. Ooh, they're actually okay right now. I'll just use this one for now so we can take a look. So I'm gonna come back to my countertop here, and you can see I turned off the heat a little while ago, and I'm able to hold it so it's not super hot. I'm gonna go ahead and open up my tamal, and you can see here, you have this nice little tamal that's steamed. You can see some of that steam coming out. Let me take it off of the husk so you can see it even more closely. So you can see that it has this nice tamal shape to it. And we can finish off this tamal by adding, let me grab a spoon. Let me grab a nice large spoon and spoon over some of our cashew cream. Let me grab some of that. Here we go. So I'm just gonna spoon over some of that cream. There we go. And then I am going to use a few of my pepitas to just garnish over that cream. So there you have the tamal completed. I'm gonna grab a fork and take a bite of this and show you the texture of the inside. So I can still hear, I don't know if it's the pepitas, so making a little bit of sound there. So I'm gonna cut into it. You should have a pretty fluffy, soft masa, and you have that nice jackfruit in there. This one I did separately. I didn't combine the pipián and the jackfruit together. I just poured a little bit of that pipián over. So there's some of it in there, but it's on top of it, and a little bit in the masa rather than being completely mixed into the jackfruit itself. So I'll take a bite. So good. It's so good. I love that pipián. I can feel the heat coming through. It's definitely, unique for most of our families, a unique recipe. First of all, we're using jackfruit, right? But then secondly, this pipián verde is a little bit less typical than the red pipián that you see. And the heat is like subtle, but it's definitely there. And it has just sort of this like very earthy element to it that's so yummy. And the cream on top is just like the icing on the cake, right? It just makes it so much better. And the crunch of the pepitas is really nice too. So if you do happen to have extra pepitas on hand, you can definitely add them for another crunch element. Any questions, especially for folks who are cooking along?
Sorry, you may have already said this, but how long did you have them in the pot?
Great question. I didn't mention that. Very important. I cook them for typically at least an hour, like 45 an hour on about medium heat. You don't need the water to be like at a rolling boil. You need it to be simmering and keep that constant steam and that heat going. I had my lid on a jar, so you're letting a little bit of that steam escape slightly. It's never going to bubble over because it's a large pot with a little bit of water, but you just want to make sure that it doesn't evaporate completely. So at least an hour. These have been cooking. I literally put these in right as we were starting class, and that's been an hour and a little over an hour 15. And this is done. So, you know, they can go a little bit over if you want. Keep in mind that as soon as you turn off the heat or you take them out, because they've been steaming, they're going to be really soft. So it's going to be a little bit difficult for you to grab tongs and just easily pull them out. So I like to turn off the heat and give them a little bit of time to just set, to just slightly cool down. Not cool down, obviously this was still steaming, it's still hot, but just cool down enough where it kind of firms up a little bit and it's not as soft and easy to break apart. Any other questions?
I have one more question. Could you go over the process of actually putting them into the pot one more time, please?
Totally, yeah. So we can go back to the pot right now. Let me show with these two that I made already. So what I would do is, if we're back at my pot right now, remember this is like the open side of the tamal from the sides and from the bottom. And so what I would do is you want to put the open side up. I'm confusing words now. So not the open side this side, but the completely open top side facing up, and the sides that have the folds towards the back. So I would place that in my pot standing up that way. And then I would continue. So what I like to do is like form a bunch of tamales outside of the pot until I have a nice pile going. And then I come over here and I start to kind of put them all along the side of the pot this way. And you're just kind of going along. All the folds are towards the back, towards the wall of the pot. And then once I have that outer ring, then I start doing another layer, same setup. The folds are going to be towards the pot. So the inner ring is going to still be exactly the same setup, but it's just an inner ring. You can add a few more towards the center. And if you need to, you can add a few laying down on top. I like to do the fold side down again, because what you're trying to do is the steam is going to create that crease for you. And so you, if you do the fold side up or out, then sometimes the fold of the corn husk, you can see here, if I did this, then you can see that my corn husk, I think, it opens up. And then as it steams, if this moves around too much, it's gonna open up again and I'm gonna have a tamal that falls apart. So you're using the shape of the pot to kind of help hold it together. Is that okay? Right, that good to go?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Of course. Any other questions? All right. So you all won't be eating this for another maybe like hour or so, maybe hour and a half too. But I'd love to see how your finished product comes out first and foremost, you know, how the process was for you. And you can absolutely take photos, post them, tag us at Todo Verde. If you have any questions that come up, you can absolutely email us or send us a DM, whatever's easiest for you.